But I'll ask you the question, Troy, do you think they're safer after having done that?
No, maybe the reverse.
Correct.
Maybe they fed the fire.
60% of the time, the first instance of concerning behavior is noticed 25 months or more in advance of an attack.
Welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast with your host, Troy Wallace, a podcast for human resources information systems professionals to help you elevate your HRIS career. We always say no one gets into HRIS on purpose, but it sure is interesting to find out how they did. We interview your HRIS peers to find out how they got tricked into the industry and what lessons and tools they use to progress their careers along the way. We discuss industry trends, AI, and even talk candidly about all the most popular HRIS platforms. Just think of it as the closest bar just outside the entrance of your favorite HR technology conference. Now you get it. Welcome in. Welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast, broadcasting live from the studios in beautiful downtown Omaha, Nebraska. We just have a great guest today, retired FBI agent Doug Hart. Doug spent 27 years in the FBI investigating violent crime. He is an expert in assessing and preventing threats in his work with businesses to implement proactive security measures. He is the founder of ThreatZero Solutions that is training and providing systems to deal with these situations. I know it seems like an outlier event, but it just so happened that in my daughter's high school, a couple days before I interviewed Doug, unfortunately, one of her high school teachers was killed. Now, it was a domestic situation, really sad, but Doug gives a few tips on preventing those situations as well. This may be the most important episode this year. I met Doug's son at the HR Technology Conference, where it ties into HR Tech and HRIS, but I thought it was a really important subject. Go get your functional HR folks, send them the podcast, your security folks, your safety folks. Doug has just really interesting insights and has some ideas and solutions that will really help. I want you to listen to the whole episode, but I'm going to point out 3 items that I think you're really going to take an interest in. Around the 13-minute mark, Doug points out 3 things that every comprehensive threat prevention program must have. If you get those 3 things, it's worth listening to the podcast. And number 2, around the 17, 18-minute mark, he talks about some statistics that could help. He doesn't want to say predict violence. Obviously, as HRIS professionals, we have access to engagement surveys, attendance, performance. There's probably some information in there that could help assess, predict potential dangerous behaviors. I found that really interesting. And then number 3, he talks about liability, and he talks a little bit about foreseeability and proximate cause. That'll show up around the 54, 55-minute mark. And he also talks about some dollar settlements that are really eye-opening. A really informative interview, something that we never want to think about, but it's a reality. Our thanks to Doug for being on the show. Please enjoy this episode with 27-year FBI veteran, Doug Hart. Doug Hart, welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast. We really appreciate you being here. I'm really trying to train myself not to talk as much on the podcast because I think the guests are way more interesting. But a little story about how I met your company, ThreatZero. I believe I met your son, Jake Hart, at the HR Technology Conference, which is just the biggest conference for all of us HRIS nerds in the country. It's tons of networking. And I was back in the entrepreneurs area of the conference, and I was talking to a few people there, and I saw the sign for ThreatZero. And so I asked Jake, who was manning the booth, I said, can I feed all of my 14-year-old daughter's text into some sort of software platform and you can tell me when she's saying something stupid or acting a fool? He said, no, not a bad idea, but not exactly what we do. But then we just started talking in general about what ThreatZero is doing. And Doug, you as the founder, how you came up with the idea for ThreatZero, how you got in the business. And I will have done your introduction already as a retired FBI agent, but can you just give us a 10,000-foot overview of how you came up with this idea to found ThreatZero, where you saw a gap in, I'll call it the marketplace for this, and how you developed your company?
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm very happy to be here. So I spent 27 years as an FBI agent, and most of that time involved in the investigation of violent crime and the prevention of violent crime. And really, where the genesis of ThreatZero Solution comes is I spent over a decade traveling all over the country, training organizations and schools on what we call violence prevention, meaning that we, through evidence and research, know about how workplace violence evolves and steps that can be taken to prevent that. And so I was very passionate about this training and teaching, but I would give my presentation and then I would walk away. And while I had provided what I felt was valuable information to an organization, I really didn't leave them with any tools like, what do I implement? How do I implement it? The information's great, but what do I do with it? And as an agent, we were able to provide the training, but unable to provide a solution or a tool for organizations to use to actually implement a program designed to make their people safer, happier, more resilient, better employees. And so that's how this was born, is that I've personally responded to 3 active shooter events. I've seen the devastation. I've seen the heartache and the tragedies. And we just wanted to provide organizations with an all-inclusive solution as it relates to preventing workplace violence. And so we utilized all of my training and experience as an FBI agent, having dealt with these types of cases, as well as the evidence that exists to support the belief that we can prevent many of these tragedies from happening, and wanted to be able to provide that and provide that service to our society.
So on the podcast, we talk a lot about technology. I just want to tell anybody listening to this, go get your HR managers, directors, those levels, send them this podcast, because I think this is going to be it's really relevant, obviously, in school systems, but obviously every organization needs to deal with this and be educated about this, unfortunately. So I was telling you about a friend of mine who used to be in law enforcement and do protection for the State Department, and he'd come to my house, and we had put, we had a front door that was just a normal front door. Well, we wanted more light in, so we put in a full glass pane window for most of the door. And he comes to the house, and he's just trained to think of threats. He's like, "What are you doing?
You are a stupid, stupid man!"
He's like, "You don't want that open window so people can see right into your house." It's like, "Well, we want more light in here." And he goes on and on, right, about the threats. Yeah. So not everybody's trained to think about that. But obviously, you being in the FBI and seeing this firsthand, are there like 2 or 3 things that HR people or people that are in positions of authority in organizations or school systems, are there, I hate to say low-hanging fruit, but some easy things that they can implement, whether it's training or particular procedures to help with these types of threats?
Absolutely. And that's that's kind of the double tragedy that takes place, is that implementing a workplace violence prevention plan is really fairly simple compared to other emergency response plans and other compliance issues that exist in the corporate world. And so the evidence to bring about positive change in terms of violence prevention is fairly straightforward. It is knowable and teachable to an organization and can be implemented very, very simply using technology. That's our platform. It's a digital platform, but absolutely, and I like the use of your word low-hanging fruit, because you would be astounded at how easy it is to educate everyone in the organization about where the dangers are, where they come from, what the dangers are, and what to do when they see them. And so what a gift that we can give to the employees and the people within our organization to equip them with that knowledge. And so, yeah, it's all low-hanging fruit for the most part, in my opinion.
And what would be those couple of things? And this is not going to be a great comparison, but I don't know if this podcast will be out by the time yours is, but Mark Williams was on the podcast. He's a LinkedIn expert. Go look at the episode. If you haven't listened to it already, we were just talking about like LinkedIn things, and he just pointed out a couple of things that were real easy tweaks to using the platform that I was like, I just didn't think about it.
Yeah.
I didn't think about it. Are those steps just putting in a training program like what you have? Is there some sort of annual screening of employees or students? Is it something that's systematic, or what is it that people can put in place to help with this problem?
Yeah, well, they need in my opinion, they need first and foremost to pay attention to the evidence, and that's what's generally missing. Almost every organization we talk to and every place we go is that very well-intentioned people are implementing security solutions without understanding the problem, without a full understanding of where their threat comes from. For instance, if I'm able to isolate in an organization that their threat is almost exclusively an internal threat, and they're spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on physical security and access control and all of these things that are designed to protect an organization from an external threat or an outside threat, then that money is misaligned. You haven't impacted in any measurable way the safety of your employees because you've put your resources in the wrong place. And so what has to exist is a comprehensive program that does essentially three things. One, we have to train all of the employees within our organization of what we call awareness of the known pre-attack behaviors. All of these things are preceded by known behaviors. So we have to teach those behaviors. Second, you have to have a mechanism or a tool for the people in your organization to be able to report or share concerns that they see once you've made them aware. And then lastly, you need to have the capability within your organization that when a concern is brought to you, that you can conduct what we call a threat assessment. You have to be able to determine what's the risk associated with this tip or this report that I've received. And so that's what ThreatZero Solutions does, is we've looked at all of the elements that need to be in place, and we've created them in a one stop shop to be able to provide that to organizations.
And, when I was talking to Jake at the HR Technology Conference, he had talked about, not the ease, that's just going to be the wrong word, because I know this is a complex thing, but, some of those behaviors that could predict a shooting 30, 60, 90 days ahead of time. Is that something that you have to be a lifetime law enforcement agent or a psychologist to look at, or there's some, a couple of key, I hate to call them signature behaviors that say, let's red flag or yellow flag on this person because, we're seeing something here.
Yeah. And so what we're trying to do actually is not predict violence, because nobody has a crystal ball. And a good analogy is, if let's say you go to a cardiologist for a checkup, and he may say, look, you've got very high cholesterol, you have a genetic history of heart disease, you're morbidly obese, your salt intake is too high, and so on and so on and so on. What that person is doing is he's identifying these risks that exist within your life. Now, he may say you're at a very high risk of having a heart-related incident, but the doctor can't predict when, and in fact, if that will actually occur. And so what we're trying to do in workplace violence prevention is make everyone in the organization aware of how violence evolves. And you're correct that it often is a process of months or years. About 60% of the time, the first instance of concerning behavior is noticed 25 months or more in advance of an attack. So we have a lot of time. The other key thing is that, a lot of the threats that organizations face are internal threats from the people that work within those organizations. Now, that's not true for all organizations. There are some organizations that deal with customers, clients, and patients. And so they have an external interaction with people that can present a threat. But any organization with employees is exposed to an internal threat. And I think you'd be very surprised to see how many of these tragedies are actually associated with people who are amongst us, who are known to us. And so really the core philosophy is, because oftentimes the people who go down this dark pathway and ultimately act violently are known to us and viewable to us, we have a baseline for their behavior. And what we're really looking for, and I can list the behaviors for you, that's not difficult to do, but what we're really targeting is, what do we recognize that a deviation in a negative way from a baseline that we have established with that person? And if I know you and I know your work performance and your attendance at work and your personality, and I see significant changes from that, that's an indicator that you could be contemplating violence, but it's also an indicator that you may be contemplating self-harm. It may be an indicator that you're suffering from severe anxiety or depression or other things that are impacting your work performance. It may be that you're the victim of harassment or bullying. That's what's great about this program, is the violence is sort of the extreme end of the spectrum. But there's a day-to-day piece of this that HR people deal with all the time. And that is just people who are overwhelmed by the circumstances in their lives. And all of these things are manifest by deviations in known behaviors. And so that's the foundation of violence prevention, is that we know through evidence and research what those behaviors are. We know how many behaviors a person displays, and we know where they display them, which is very often in the workplace. We know who sees them, which is their coworkers, and we know how to intercede to mitigate violence. And that's the wonderful benefit of a workplace violence prevention program that should exist in all organizations in this day and age, which unfortunately it exists in only a small fraction of the organizations that exist.
Well, I thought I was going to have a hard time relating this back to, we IT, HRIS data nerds. Mm-hmm. But now I found my entree already, right? So I'm not saying you can algorithmically solve this, but there's a place for performance management systems to play.
Oh, for sure.
Something that can detect that deterioration of performance, or, some people do regular employee surveys or engagement surveys or something. And there's probably some messages wrapped in that data that, if you have the ability to report on them, you can see maybe someone trending the wrong way, or a group trending the wrong way. So number one, any resources. We're not going to get into. Doug's done a really interesting cases And we're not going to get into like some of his casework when he was an active FBI, but I listened to a couple of his interviews that I'll link in the show notes. Any resources he's willing to give us, we'll put in the show notes as well. So I just wanted to say that. But let's say that we could put every workplace conversation and also aggregate, performance metrics. Are there certain language things? I know you already mentioned, changes in behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't want to live in a world where we're recording absolutely everything that goes on in an organization, but theoretically, could you find enough patterns or themes or behaviors where you could almost create a watch list of things, or at least people that are demonstrating those behaviors?
Yes and no. It kind of depends on the industry and it depends on the organization. So I'll give you a school example that's applicable in the corporate world. Are you familiar with the software Gaggle?
I am not.
So it's a software that a lot of schools use to monitor for certain phrases or words in the information systems utilized by the students. And so, if it would catch, suicide or shoot or kill, or, there's a large number of words that are indicative of someone planning violence or self-harm. And these are systems where there's no right to privacy, which I think is applicable in some of the corporate world. So, for instance, we have clients that are in the manufacturing space, and most of their employees are on the line processing or building or doing whatever they do for that company. And so, there's not a lot of electronic information exchange going on there. But we also have clients who are in the, financial planning and accounting and clean energy, and we're in place in a number of organizations, and those organizations that are heavily oriented towards the flow of information, where you're seeing a lot of email exchanges and things like that. There are some technology tools out there, and that's going to have to be something that the organization would determine whether they want to monitor their employees in that way. But there are a number of technology-driven tools that exist to, for lack of a better word, monitor conversations electronically. Now, that's not your phone calls, but that's really just, emails and other messages that you would send electronically that can sort of watch for keywords that are indicative of a potential problem. So that exists and is in use in a lot of schools today.
I am taking a note right now because I know for sure neither my 11 nor 14-year-old have an expectation of privacy on their phones. So I am going to see if we get a personal version of that software to see if I can use it for the kids. That's interesting. That's kind of what, when Jake and I struck up that conversation at HR Tech, that's kind of how it started.
Yeah.
That is interesting. So it's out there, but then obviously if you don't, I'm assuming that to some extent your training can help people start to recognize some of those behaviors and signatures.
And so this isn't, we're in an interesting place as it relates to HR and tech. I mean, the fact of the matter is the vast majority of these types of tragedies that we see take place in the workplace. They own almost half of this. We often think of schools because there are innocent children, and we're shocked when those things happen in our schools, but it's a much more of a problem in the corporate world amongst organizations where these things happen. And, a lot of times it's as a result of an adverse employment action. A lot of times it is a domestic violence spillover into the workplace. But what we have to realize is that in terms of the landscape, these types of tragedies are increasing year over year. They are significantly internal threats, which means we need to pay attention to what's going on in our company. And the liability landscape has changed dramatically over the course of the past 30 or 40 years in terms of who's held liable when one of these things happen. And it's shocking to me the absence of any kind of workplace violence prevention plan or training that exists in most organizations. They'll have their mandatory sexual harassment training or whatever standard suite of here's the things you have to do, but most don't have this in place. And in this day and age, due to the prevalence of these things happening, they really should have something that's there to protect the people in their organization. And then again, as I said before, there's a host of other positive benefits that really resonate with HR folks in terms of the mental health and wellness of their employees, the resilience of their employees, the happiness and safety of their employees. When you have a safe workplace and people feel comfortable being there, you're going to have more productive employees. And again, with these types of programs in place, you can drastically reduce the exposed liability from a tragedy.
So let's say that somebody's maybe taken your training or they've learned these skills someplace, and maybe you've done just a wonderful job of helping your frontline managers understand this, recognize it. And now let's say we've moved on to step 2, where, hey, 363 days of the year, no problem, but 364th day, somebody's come forward, or maybe a couple of people have come forward, and they've said, okay, we've noticed this, and maybe we're talking about a population of 3 to 5 employees. What's the next step? You want to kind of want to be measured in, monitoring somebody or, really watching somebody just based on what they're said. But is there a right way to, once something's kind of been identified or you're seeing some of the behaviors, that next step of, obviously you're not just going to fire somebody, but to monitor those people that might have been flagged?
Yeah, great question. And you'd be surprised how many people they do that's the knee-jerk reaction is let's terminate this employee. But what this is about is really the behavior is sort of the very first step in threat assessment. It is just an investigation. It's not an investigation to find evidence of a crime. It's an investigation to determine if that person poses a risk of violence. And so, I don't know about you, Troy, but most people have had an incident where they've really, they've lost their temper. They've had a bad day or a bad event. And that's typically what we see is this sliver, this little piece in time. And we have to go beyond the event and approach this holistically. So typically, a concerning behavior or a comment or something comes to our attention, and then it's our obligation, because that's our employee, to look further to see if, hey, is this just a bad day, or is there something more going on here? And then that process of investigating to see if there's something more going on is called behavioral threat assessment. And it's really not about being Big Brother. This is not about I'm on constant alert for behaviors. It's more that we care about the well-being of those that are around us in our organization. And if we've noticed aberrations in their behavior, then we have an obligation to look into that. And behavioral threat assessment is just a series of questions, and it walks you through. The very first thing we do is what we call information gathering. So we're going to look at, what do their coworkers have concerns? What else is happening in their life? Do they have social media that we can look at? Is there postings that are concerning? Have they sent text messages? Have they made overt threats? Really, what we're really trying to dial in on is what we call attack-related behavior. Can we identify? It's one thing to say something. It's another thing entirely to do something. Are they on this pathway of action where they're moving towards self-harm or harm of others? And we know the questions to ask. We can provide those questions. And by engaging in this process of behavioral threat assessment, you come to get a bigger holistic picture that gives you a pretty clear idea of what do I need to do? What steps can I take to then manage that, as you said, to monitor that? A lot of companies, their knee-jerk reaction is let's terminate them and get them off the premises. But I'll ask you the question, Troy, do you think they're safer after having done that?
No, maybe the reverse.
Correct.
Maybe they fed the fire.
So exactly. So we think out of sight, out of mind, but and certainly there are behaviors that people engage in that warrant their termination. There are policies and things that are in place. I'm not saying you should keep someone who is a threat, in place, or someone who has violated company policy and you need to part ways. What I'm saying is that when you make that decision in a concerning environment or with concerning behavior to part ways with that employee, what is your visibility? That employee knows your organization inside and out. They know how to get in and out of the facility in all likelihood. They know the other employees. And so you need to know, are they harboring a grievance? Have you created an additional grievance by terminating them? Do they have anything positive or hopeful going on in their lives? Have you helped them transition into other employment? Are they sitting at home fuming about what happened? And is that pressure cooker getting, hotter and hotter? And so there's a host of things that we need to do when we terminate somebody for disciplinary actions. Versus, I would separate that from just your normal everyday, hey, we have cutbacks or your performance is subpar and we're going to terminate you. I'm really referring to those instances where you're terminating an employee because of safety concerns or because of a deteriorating performance that's associated with these pre-attack behaviors that we can identify.
So, well, I'm glad there is a distinction, right? Because we talked about, threat of violence versus threat of being a jerk, which is completely legal. Sure.
Well, the jerk store called. They're running out of you.
Threat of having a bad day. Now, if the other two were qualifiers, I'd be monitored right after I coach my sixth graders in basketball.
Right.
Sometimes you come out of there just a little bit frustrated.
And that's a great point because, we need to know that's not a threat. And if somebody's having a bad day or somebody has a bad temper or somebody has some anger management problems, none of those things, imply a threat of violence. And so we have to go through this process to really distinguish, is there a serious or a significant threat? And roughly 80% of the time there isn't as we go through these things, but it's that other 20% where there is a serious or a significant threat that we need to worry about.
And what is your opinion? And I certainly did not put this one on the interview guide, but what is your opinion of pre-employment, like criminal background?
Yeah.
Do you think that that's just absolutely necessary for every organization? Is there, what is the term, recidivism?
Yeah.
That there's just it's known that it is certainly more likely to happen with people who have committed certain types of violent crimes in the past.
If someone has a history of violent behavior, that is indicative of potential future violent behavior. But we've had a number of these incidents across all sectors of industry and commerce where these people have absolutely no history of violence. And so we've got to be careful with that one. I believe that we need to do a good job of screening those employees before we bring them into the workplace. However, there's theory and there's application, and how practical is that? We have a client that they're in a processing space, food processing. Their annual turnover rate is roughly 60%. It's a hard job, and people don't stay in it very long. And so, how with that rate of turnover and the number of employees they have, how are they able to navigate, background checks and so on and so forth? So there's, that really depends on the capabilities of the organization and what the organization does, as it relates to how in-depth of a background do you do. But again, these are slow burns. This is stuff that manifests itself over weeks, months, even years. And so it's not necessarily something you would catch, doing an abbreviated background check before bringing somebody on board. You just simply don't have the visibility at that point.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to take a deep breath, because so far this has been fantastic. And it just you get your heartbeat going. And to be honest, I wasn't going to talk about this either, but we on Monday just had a teacher at our high school shot and killed. And it wasn't within the high school. It was a domestic violence issue. But you just wonder, what you're teaching. Well, no, let's talk about that. If you do this training, is there anything there that might help you pick up if a coworker was in a danger zone, high threat zone, in a domestic? Someone's coming to work, and somebody's coming to work. In this case, she'd worked at the high school for 10 years, same people. You wonder if people can get some training. Could they have somehow maybe picked up on the pattern or saw that there was a risk there in the domestic violence? Is there anything that we can do to help there?
So absolutely. You've just said a couple of critical things, Troy. And the first, I want to emphasize, and I'll say this slowly for anybody who's listening. People can't be expected to do what they've never been trained to do. And so if we don't teach the people in our organization about these indicators, let's take domestic violence, for example. We see a large number of violent tragedies in the workplace that take place because of domestic violence spillover. Those statistics would shock you, but it's typically male against female. But those targets become indiscriminate most oftentimes when the workplace violence event takes place. And so that man, in all likelihood, may not know where the female lives any longer, but he certainly knows where she works. And so what we've done at ThreatZero Solutions as part of our awareness and training program, we call them micro trainings. We do one short training each month. That training is based off of, we can take you to the published research for each training. But one of the months of the year, we have a specific training on domestic violence. And we talk about exactly what you just said. We teach people what are the signs of somebody who's who is in a domestic violence relationship. And we talk about what those signs are, how they can help that person. We have a specific training about adverse employment actions. So if you're getting ready to terminate the employment of an individual, how do you do that, particularly if it's a person of concern, and how do you account for that potential violence associated with that event? And so we've you're absolutely correct that there are almost inevitably signs and behaviors associated with someone who's being victimized in a domestic violence situation or a sexual harassment situation. They're all knowable, but if people have never been trained what those behaviors are and what to do when they see them, then it's completely unrealistic for us to expect that they will somehow intuitively know what to do and recognize those behaviors. So the training portion of this, which is, literally 5 minutes a month. And I think most organizations, their employees have 5 minutes to spare each month, but you can tackle all of these key behaviors associated with workplace violence, domestic violence, and so forth, and you can educate your organization. And that's what needs to happen.
It reminds me a little bit, if you've ever worked with an organization, and HR consultants may understand this, somebody in oil and gas or heavy manufacturing who's adopted like the safety moments philosophy, where every meeting, even if you are an external contractor, like they expect you to come when it's your turn to the meeting with some sort of 30-second blurb. And it sounds like you're kind of talking about that. Now that could be, I think what you're training is encapsulated in safety in general, so that would probably qualify. But for organizations to have, maybe it doesn't have to be every meeting, but like you said, a monthly or something that's made available to them to keep the awareness. Because I think part of what they're doing with the safety awareness is just that. It's just keeping it top of mind.
Right.
Well, geez, I tried to lighten the mood a little bit, and I went deper, into an intense conversation. So I didn't warn you about this, but we'd like to do something we call the lightning round. We're going to do an abbreviated version because we want to get you out of here on time. A couple questions, try and keep them fun. If you want to pass, just say pass on the question. They're typically not very controversial, but we put some fake time on the fake clock. I will ask the questions more rapidly, but your answers do not have to be rapid.
Okay.
All right. Number one. So, FBI for 27 years, is that right?
Yeah.
Any kind of favorite memories? And we're not talking about like the best case that you cracked, but maybe where you got to interact with interesting people or just interesting situations, or just maybe it was just your graduation day when you actually entered the FBI.
No, for me, the most cherished memories I have are those. I was involved in a lot of pretty difficult cases, child abductions and serial killings and so on and so forth. And those are multi-year efforts oftentimes. And so, for me, it was the camaraderie and being an advocate for those who, because of the circumstances, could no longer advocate for themselves, and really just, doing my best to serve the cause of justice and the sense of satisfaction. I just finished a second trial in a case involving 4 homicides in 2 states, and that was a 5-year effort. So, to finish something out with a group of people that all of you have poured your heart and soul into it for year after year after year, seeking justice for those victims, those are the things that you reflect on. There's lots of fun times, lots of great people in this profession, wonderful people, and, lots of exciting things that you get to do. But when it gets down to the core of it, for me, it's knowing that we've sought whatever justice could be had for someone who's been the victim of a serious crime.
Right, and I'm going to make a call back to another episode with Tim Sackett, and we were talking more about retention in workplaces, but it comes back to, did somebody have great camaraderie at their organization, which sounds like, when you worked on those longer cases, you had the opportunity to build the relationships. And then he said, in his case, the biggest indicator of somebody not turning over is, do they have a best friend at the workplace? So you can go back and listen to that episode
those relationships,
with Tim Sackett, but it's similar, right?
The
relationship, the camaraderie.
Those relationships are critical. And, I think a lot of places would be surprised at I bet if you asked most people, they would be able to tell you about some sort of close call they've had at work, some concerning incident with another employee. And that is one of the parts of what we talk about is in mitigating violence is, does that person have a good, friendly relationship with another responsible adult? And if they do, then that oftentimes is a great resource and a great mitigator to potential violence in the workplace.
Absolutely. All right, let's go on to question number 2.
Okay.
2.
Do you have a hobby or interest that most people don't know about?
I love to do ultra running. So trail races is.
Oh my goodness! I'm trying to keep this soft.
I have had some.
That is
we use
that
it
is
as a travel.
Quite a hobby.
Yeah, we go to wonderful places, and I did it with. I have 2 sons, and they're both grown and married and out of the house, so we don't get to do that together very much anymore. But for several years, we would travel to different places in the West and go on these long runs in the mountains, and just a wonderful challenge and some just fantastic memories with my sons and doing hard things.
And you're still doing it?
Yeah.
Oh, so I will turn you on to a podcast. So when I came to the idea to start doing podcasts, I went through an incubator, and one of the guys that was doing a podcast specifically on ultra running.
Yeah.
And, I helped him out, and I lined him up with someone in my neighborhood who did it. And I think you guys are all crazy because I just don't get it, right? I like basketball, that's my thing. I'm surprised at, how many people are willing to get out there and do not only a marathon, but sometimes 2 marathons in a day.
Yeah.
That is intense. All right, let's go and move on to question number 3.
3.
If you were not in security or threat management field, what other career do you think you might have pursued?
Oh, that's hard. I absolutely love law enforcement as a profession. I've enjoyed it very much. I'm a big reader and I like to teach. So I think I could, if I had to choose a second career, I could see myself being a professor or a teacher. I think I would enjoy that.
Ah, there you go. There you go. All right. And number 4.
4.
We'll make this the last one. What's the most surprising thing that you've learned since you've started ThreatZero? Well, is it your distaste for the taxes? Is it just the marketing pieces of it? What is it that has been most surprising to you?
Well, most surprising, it certainly takes a lot of effort. I think most surprising to me has been the fact that in my mind, from my life, I would think this would be top of mind, that doing the right thing for your employees, investing in your human resources by making sure that your folks are safer. So the biggest surprise to me is the lack of anything in place. And perhaps that's naive on my part. Maybe that's because people just simply know about it or don't know what to do about it. But, there are solutions that we've created that are very, very cost effective, very easy to implement, and satisfy all of these requirements to accomplish that reduction in liability. The other thing that I don't know if surprising is the right word, but we've had a couple of marvelous success stories that demonstrate the efficacy of this program and I believe have saved lives. And so to put this much effort into creating our application and our platform and producing all of our training videos and our reporting tool and our threat assessment tool, it's satisfying to see people using it and preventing violence, which is our whole mission, because they have this program in place. And so I derive a lot of satisfaction when we hear from clients and customers, hey, this happened, and we believe we prevented a tragedy from taking place. And so that's what keeps us going in the face of the challenges of starting and running a business.
Well, that is a good segue because coming back into this more the serious stuff, I want to talk a little bit about what's, if you've got an HR director or VP out there who wants to get a little budget for these types of things, how do you make the business case for it? But first, before we get there, is there any place for crisis scenarios, simulations, in your training? Is that part of it, or is that just really too difficult to do and not as impactful?
So no, there's a place for those things within the proper perspective. But what I see most often, Troy, is that people will conduct a drill or a training, and then they'll feel like they've satisfied whatever that. There's just a huge focus on compliance, and we've got to get outside of, hey, we just want to be compliant. So yes, there's a place for training and for drills, but because we know about how these things evolve and where violence generally comes from in the workplace, we're really in a position to get at the heart of it, the root of it, and focus our efforts there. And so again, that's sort of industry specific. There are some industries and manufacturing, so on and so forth, where the drills and exercises are important because they're engaged in the work that they do is inherently dangerous. But there are many more organizations where that danger doesn't exist by virtue of the work that they do. And I think that some of the drills and exercises are potentially less beneficial in those circumstances. We do have to, in this day and age, talk about response to any kind of a crisis. And so, at an annual basis or something along those lines to review your emergency response plans is important. But if we're just counting on response, here's the question I ask. Would you rather respond to a tragedy, or would you rather prevent one from happening in the first place? And so the response training is great. I'm not negating that, but let's also understand what prevention can do for us and the place that prevention has in this conversation.
Right. And here's, I think I told Jake about this when we were talking. Actually, no, I think I told the training company. So when we were at this HR tech conference, there are 400 different booths, and it's like, it's like taking a drink out of a water hose. There's so much information coming at you. But one of the, I would consider major training companies in the space is called Cornerstone. They do performance and training and are in that software space. And they had these virtual reality headsets that they're now building some of their training around. And I told them about you guys. And I said, they put me into a simulation with I don't swear on this podcast. I'm not going to swear, but they put you across the desk from a guy who was, I'll just call him a real jerk, a virtual jerk. And they let you walk through a scenario of, kind of going through a performance coaching session with this guy. And this guy's combative, and boy, they did a good job programming, this guy. But I could foresee, something like that working where it's just a conversation, and your job is to, once the conversation is over with the employee, be able to choose, like, was the right conditions there? Yes or no? And helping people point out, whether it was or not.
Sure.
So anyways, I love to make connections. So Cornerstone and ThreatZero can get together, put that together at some point.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic. So, all right. So let's go back to we'll make my last question because I know we're at the hour. If you're an HR director, VP, and you want to put together a business case, what are things that you can help people point to, or what has been successful in other organizations? And, if you're going to do this, obviously you need a little bit of a budget.
Yeah.
And Are there resources, studies, things that can help people make their case?
Absolutely. And so, boy, I could talk for a while on that question. Certainly, we have all of that. Like we will essentially, there are 5 types of threats in the workplace. And so when someone comes to us, we help them identify where is the threat in your workplace. Are you properly aligned? That's easy for us to do. But when you look at overcoming resistance to change, again, I go back to a lot of companies have had some close calls and they need to recognize those for what they are. But the cost implementing a workplace violence prevention program, such as ours, is minimal compared to the cost of physical security measures, which may or may not be effective depending on where your threat comes from. Secondly, it's the right thing to do for your people. It's investing in your human resources. And, we just can't, if we get into the corporate council, which is another group that should look at this podcast, when you look at the atmosphere, the liability, I'm frequently hired as an expert witness in civil cases. And there's really 2 key elements that people are looking at when they have an incidence of violence in a workplace. And the first is what they call foreseeability. Did you as a company have the ability to foresee this event happening? Were there signs, indicators? Did you have any program in place to train your people about the dangers, of workplace violence? And then the second thing after foreseeability is what they call proximate cause. And that's where most organizations have a pretty big exposure, because whereas a school environment, the school has to be open to those children who live in their geographic region to come to school there. But a company hires that employee. The proximate cause, you are the one who brought that person into this organization. You are responsible for them being here. And because you're responsible for that person being in your organization, there's a liability associated with that. And so having a workplace violence prevention program not only makes your employees better, healthier as it relates to mental health and wellness, safer because they know what to look for and what to do if they see it. You also, in terms of cost, what's the cost compared to a lawsuit? I'll take an extreme example, but it's a recent one. The Las Vegas Music Festival shooting that is the worst active shooter event in our nation. MGM recently settled for $800 million.
Wow.
And all they did is rent the guy a room. He wasn't their employee. And so I don't want to harp on, we live in a litigious society. But liability for businesses in as it relates to workplace violence is something they should be very, very concerned about, because these things are happening with such greater frequency. That liability landscape has changed. And what companies need to understand, if they really care about a safe workplace environment, is many, many times, most times, the behaviors are displayed at work and the behaviors are observed by the employees of the organization. That's the whole sort of intelligence network that exists within a company that is the basis for violence prevention, is teaching your people what to look for and having the tools in place to respond to that. And some of that is tech-driven. So I guess I like to think of it as, human observation that can be enhanced through technology. But there's absolutely a significant HR function in this, because as we were visiting before we started recording, in many mid-size and smaller companies, this corporate safety is relegated to HR. But even if it isn't, for pennies on the dollar, as it compared to physical security or other things, it's somewhat as if you're buying an insurance policy. And because our program is 100% evidence-based, you can't negate the research. You simply can't. And so if you'll follow those protocols, then I believe you can be successful. And those are the things that we were referring to earlier. We've had a couple of remarkable success stories from this program. And so, I know that it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to say this because if you weren't doing this, I know you'd be doing something else, ultra marathons. I wish a service like yours didn't have to exist.
I wish it didn't have
But it
to
does.
either. Yeah, and that's the unfortunate world we live in right now.
So I'm going to consider this, we're early in the season, but the most important conversation that we've had on the HRIS Careers podcast so far. So, Doug, we really appreciate you being on the show. Many thanks. Before you get out of here, I know you can be found at ThreatZero.org. Where else can people connect with you, Doug?
I'm on LinkedIn, and just as we've had a great conversation, you'll never get a hard sell from us. We are all about solutions. We're all about flexibility, and we love. We have just a really broad spectrum of organizations that we work with that utilize our services, and from the layperson's perspective, this is such a hard problem to tackle. I think sometimes people get intimidated by what they perceive as the complexity of it. But reach out, ThreatZero.org or on LinkedIn, and we are more than happy to walk you through all of this and show you where your threats would come from, and to build. We've had to be very flexible to accommodate the different types of industries that we work with and how the training can be implemented in retail environments, in industrial environments, in office environments. We're certainly able to accommodate anything, and we just love to have the conversations. If we can be of service to any of your listeners or their organizations, that's what we're here for. We want to be the solution and help organizations deal with these complex safety concerns.
That's great. So I'm going to now dumb down everything with, if you want to go over to the YouTube channel, I'm going to show you the shirt that I was donning, one of them that I was donning at the HR Tech Conference. And it is, let me get the mic out of the way here. Get a very good look. So it is the HRIS No One Gets Here on Purpose t-shirt. And if you want one, anybody, the first person who emails me at Troy, TROY.Wallace, WALLACE, at HRIScareers.com, or the first one to put t-shirt in the comments of YouTube, we will be shipping you this beautiful t-shirt. It says HRIS Careers on the back, and we will put an image in the show notes. Doug, again, I really appreciate it. Again, we will link everything about what you guys are doing in the show notes. This was wonderful. And again, I think probably the most important conversation that we'll have this year.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely that, Troy. It's just a conversation we need to have. It's progress, not perfection. And these are the things that we need to be engaged with and talking about and finding answers for, so that we can be about accomplishing the purposes of our various organizations and not having to worry about some extreme event happening. And so it's just great to meet someone who's willing to speak candidly about this landscape, and really enjoyed being here, and absolutely thankful to you for having me on.
Absolutely. It's fantastic. And to the HRIS Careers community, we will talk to you all later.
Here we go.